They said she was just support, a supply girl in a vest that didn't carry the weight of medals or scars, just patches and straps meant for carrying boxes and bandages, not history, not firepower, not the kind of thunder that could shake an entire battlefield. And if you agree that too many times heroes are underestimated until it's too late, like and subscribe, because this is the story of the young woman they misjudged, until the day her vest shifted and revealed a badge none of them thought someone her age could possibly earn. But before that moment, before the whispers and the looks of disbelief, there was a beginning, and it started like all beginnings, quietly, with a story hidden in plain sight. Not long ago, in a forward operating base set against the dust and wind of a hostile region, she stepped off the transport with her helmet tilted low, eyes steady but unreadable, a figure in her late 20s who, to the untrained eye, looked like any other support technician sent to patch up radios, track shipments, and maybe, if the men were being honest, bring them coffee when the sun got too heavy. They laughed under their breath, some with smirks that carried the old arrogance of soldiers who thought they had seen it all, and when they looked at her vest, with the word support stitched sharp across it, that arrogance turned into dismissal. Just another background presence, a body moving crates while the real fighters took their posts. But the truth was already written on her, tucked beneath fabric, sewn into the lining of her gear, waiting to be seen when fate decided it was time, because under that vest was a mark so rare that even the most seasoned sergeant in that camp would have gone silent had he noticed it earlier. The emblem of the Grendel Storm Cannon program, a badge earned not by luck, not by connections, but through sweat, blood, and a crucible of trials most soldiers twice her age had failed. Still, in that moment, no one knew, not yet, and so, when she walked into the briefing room, men shuffled their chairs without giving her space. Conversations kept rolling without including her, and the commander glanced past her name like it didn't matter whether she was there or not, as though she was furniture in the corner instead of one of the sharpest blades they had. She didn't flinch, didn't protest, didn't raise her voice. She simply sat, listened, and watched, her silence mistaken for weakness, when in reality it was the patience of someone who had already been tempered in fire before most of them had ever learned what true fire was. And as the night dropped over the camp and the low hum of generators set the rhythm, the first shots cracked in the distance, warning bursts that grew into a storm as insurgents tested the perimeter, their vehicles edging closer, their gunfire peppering the walls. The camp stirred, alarms blared, boots pounded the ground. And suddenly the men who had joked about her hours earlier were scrambling for positions, loading rifles with shaking hands, yelling for cover, while she, still quiet, still steady, moved into the chaos like it was nothing new. One of the sergeants shouted for her to stay back, told her to stick to the crates, told her she'd get in the way, but when she bent to lift a belt of ammunition, her vest shifted, and for the first time someone caught sight of the insignia glinting faintly in the harsh lights. And his face froze, because there it was, the badge no one in that camp had expected to see. The mark of someone who had survived the Grendel Storm Cannon trials, a program whispered about in barracks like a myth, a test of endurance and firepower so brutal that only a handful of soldiers had ever carried its emblem. And suddenly the whisper spread. That girl, that quiet one they thought was just logistics, she had it. And as the firefight grew louder and closer, as tracer rounds lit up the night sky, eyes turned toward her, some with confusion, some with sudden respect, but all with the dawning realization that they had made a mistake. She didn't move to explain herself, didn't waste words convincing them. She simply adjusted her gear, checked the weapon nearest her, and waited for the moment when the choice between collapse and survival would land squarely in her hands. Because the truth is, long before she was 20, she had already proven herself in ways they couldn't imagine, and though they didn't know that history yet, though they couldn't see the hours, the pain, the grit that had carried her to that badge, they were about to find out, not through a speech or a story, but through the echo of fire that was about to break across that battlefield, carried by hands they had dismissed just hours ago as nothing more than support. She hadn't always been the quiet woman who walked into a camp and let others underestimate her. Because before she ever saw her 20s, she was a kid in a small town where the nights were long and the streets offered little more than dead ends. And it was there, at 17, that she made the choice that would shape her life forever. She enlisted, not because anyone told her she couldn't, but because too many people assumed she wouldn't, and she carried inside her the echo of her father's stories. He'd been a Gulf War mechanic who never bragged, but sometimes, when the night got too still, would let slip tales of desert heat, of broken engines under fire, of soldiers stranded until he made steel breathe again. And she grew up watching his hands work metal like it was clay, learning patience, precision, and respect for machines that could mean the difference between life and death. So when the recruiter raised his eyebrows at her age and size, she only smirked and signed the paper. Knowing she had something to prove, boot camp hit her like a wall of fire. Endless drills, screaming voices, mud that clung to her skin like it wanted her to quit. But instead of breaking, she grew sharper, harder, carrying herself not with noise, but with an iron calm that unsettled even her drill instructors. Because she never begged for mercy and never cracked under pressure, she simply endured, and that endurance became her weapon. By 18, her natural talent with heavy gear was impossible to ignore. While others struggled to assemble basic weapon mounts, she was already diagnosing recoil patterns and sight alignments, the kind of intuitive mechanical reading that had instructors muttering she belonged in specialized training. And that's exactly what happened. She was offered a chance to try for a classified program, one most didn't dare whisper about, the Grendel Storm Cannon trials, designed to test soldiers against the extremes of both physical and mental resilience. A program that demanded not just strength, but an ability to tame machinery so brutal it could crush a man who mishandled it. At first, she wasn't taken seriously there either. The candidates were older, bulkier, men who sneered at the kid in their ranks. But when the first phase began, a grueling sequence of marches carrying over 100 pounds of gear through blistering heat, she refused to fall behind, her legs screaming, her lungs burning, but her will like steel, and by the time others collapsed, she was still standing, not because she was stronger, but because she refused to stop. The second phase was worse. Weapon trials, each candidate forced to assemble, fire, and repair massive prototype cannons under punishing time limits. The air filled with smoke, ears ringing, sweat dripping into eyes, and she thrived, her hands moving with the same patience her father had taught her, fixing jams, adjusting calibrations, coaxing life out of weapons that others treated like monsters. And then came the final crucible, a simulation that pushed the human body to its breaking point. Days without sleep, constant noise, endless problem-solving under stress, while instructors screamed and faces and explosions rocked the ground, and one by one, the older men fell apart, lashing out, giving up, failing under the weight of exhaustion. But she didn't. She kept her head low, her focus sharp, and when her turn came to operate the storm cannon itself, to unleash its devastating roar across the range, she did it not with desperation but with a terrifying calm, controlling the recoil, guiding its fire with precision that stunned even the hardened evaluators. When it ended, when the dust settled and the scores were tallied, she was one of the only ones left standing, a teenager among broken men, and she was handed a small, heavy badge stitched with the Grendel insignia, a badge few ever touched and fewer ever wore, and she tucked it inside her vest, not to flaunt, but to remember the fire she had walked through. When she turned 19, she was already deployed in support roles, her official title reading logistics and tech, but beneath that paper mask she carried the weight of something no one around her understood, and she never corrected them when they assumed she was just there to push crates, because she knew someday the battlefield itself would reveal the truth. By 20, she had already been in combat zones most soldiers never saw in their entire careers. But she wore her silence like armor, letting others believe what they wanted. Because she had learned in those trials that respect isn't demanded, it's earned in the split-second moments when survival hangs by a thread, and the quietest soldier turns out to be the deadliest one in the room. The night had turned black as coal, broken only by the orange glow of tracer fire streaking the horizon, the rattle of machine guns, and the thud of mortars shaking the walls of the forward operating base. And in the middle of it all, men who had earlier dismissed her as nothing more than a background figure were now scrambling with fear etched into their faces, their boots pounding mud, their voices cracking as they shouted for ammunition, for cover, for someone to take command. She didn't shout, didn't panic, She simply moved, her body weaving through the chaos with the calm of someone who had already lived this moment 100 times in trials harsher than anything reality could throw at her. And when she reached the mounted cannon stationed at the far edge of the wall, the same one others had cursed as useless because it jammed every few bursts, she dropped her gear without hesitation, hands working the bolts, clearing the chamber, running diagnostics as bullets snapped the air around her head. The men nearby were ducking, flinching, shouting for her to get down. But she didn't listen. She knew this machine, knew its flaws, knew how to coax it back to life like she had years ago in the trial fields before she was even 20. And when the mechanism clicked into place and the weapon roared back to life, the recoil nearly tore the mount off its brace. But she was ready, bracing, guiding, steadying, firing controlled bursts that ripped through the enemy vehicles. Pressing forward, their silhouettes lit in sudden explosions that sent waves of shock through the camp. For a moment, there was silence, not in the battlefield, but in the men around her, who had stopped shouting to watch the woman they thought was just support bend a weapon that most of them couldn't even fire straight into a tool of absolute precision. Her badge glinting faintly now that her vest had shifted fully open, its mark no longer hidden but declared, and someone finally whispered the words none of them thought they'd ever say out loud. Storm Cannon. She's Storm Cannon trained. And suddenly the mocking nicknames, the dismissals, the careless arrogance turned to wide-eyed respect, even fear, because now they understood that she hadn't been silent because she was weak. She had been silent because she had already survived things they couldn't imagine. The enemy didn't give them time to sit in awe, because the advance was relentless, trucks barreling forward with mounted weapons spitting fire, and just when it seemed like the wall would buckle, she swung the cannon, calculating vectors in her head like a second language, cutting through tires, detonating fuel tanks, dismantling their assault piece by piece until what had looked like an unstoppable tide suddenly faltered, vehicles burning out one after another under the controlled storm she unleashed. But it wasn't just firepower, it was leadership, too, because as she fired, she called out coordinates, directed riflemen to choke points, ordered cover fire with the authority of someone who had been born to lead, and men who hours ago wouldn't make space for her in a briefing room now followed her every word without hesitation, falling into rhythm with the calm, commanding voice that cut through the chaos better than any officer's. Still, the night tested them, because one wave broke and another followed, heavier, with mortar rounds slamming into the compound, dust choking the air, screams rising from the wounded, and for a heartbeat the line wavered, the thought of collapse creeping into even the strongest hearts. But then her voice rang out again, not desperate, not panicked, but sharp, steady, carrying that badge's weight. On me. And she moved the cannon into a new position, dragging the mount with raw determination, rallying soldiers to form a defensive arc that blunted the next surge. And though her arms shook with exhaustion, though her lungs burned, she never let go, never faltered, until the dawn's first light broke over the horizon and revealed a field of smoldering wrecks, the enemy retreating into smoke, leaving behind only silence, the kind of silence that feels earned, heavy, sacred. When it was over, when the adrenaline drained and the dust settled, the men gathered, their faces hollow with shock, their uniforms caked in mud and ash, and they looked at her differently now, not as the girl with the support patch, not as someone to be overlooked, but as the soldier who had saved their lives, the one who carried a badge most of them had only heard about in rumors, a mark earned before she had even been old enough to order a beer back home. And in that moment they understood that the battlefield doesn't measure worth by age or gender or by titles sewn into vests. It measures worth by who stands tall when everything else is burning, and she had stood taller than all of them. Later, when reports were written and medals handed out, her name was listed under logistics, support, the quiet misclassification that had followed her since she was 17. But the men who had been there knew better, and they passed her story like a whisper, like a legend, of the woman in her late 20s who carried a badge sewn from fire and grit before she was 20. The one who silenced doubt not with speeches but with thunder, and the one who proved, once and for all, that the deadliest soldier in the room is often the one no one ever saw coming.